So I'm going to talk to you about nature-based solutions to climate change, as Anne said. And I said in the abstract for this that there's the twin climate and ecological crises. And so I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm going to assume that you've heard of those in the media. I'm going to assume that you're aware that climate change is happening, that humans have some impact on it, that there's a lot of things that we do to emit greenhouse gases, and those things cause what we call anthropogenic climate change. So climate change caused by people on top of the natural climate change that normally happens. As I said, I'm a scientist. I guess I'm a climate scientist. My research is mostly in how climate change impacts biodiversity, so how it impacts nature. But I'm also, I think, being a climate scientist, in order to try and stay positive, you have to start thinking about solutions. I think people need hope in order to act, in order to do anything. And so I'm talking to you about nature-based solutions because I think they're a cool way to try and help us cope with climate change, help us act on climate change, but also get some other benefits as well. And quite a few people, I guess, seem to agree with me, at least that are ecologists like I am. I'm going to be talking to you about some of the findings of a report that I helped edit, which was led by the British Ecological Society policy team. It was aimed at policymakers. We had a launch to Scottish Parliament back in, I think it was in 2022, so it was not long after it was actually published. And so this was a report that we were trying to persuade policymakers of the potential in nature-based solutions. And it was the first at the time real comprehensive review of the potential of nature-based solutions in the UK. And in a moment, I'll tell you what a nature-based solution is, what counts as a nature-based solution. So we had over 100 experts contributing to this edited report, and we were, as I said, trying to influence the mindset of policymakers. So what is a nature-based solution? In general, it's something that addresses any kind of societal problem in a way that benefits both people and nature. So we're looking for things that are beneficial to us in some way, but also to nature. And specifically, nature-based solutions for climate change are things that help us either reduce the impact of, either reduce climate change, reduce the amount that happens, or to cope with the amount of climate change that is happening already. So that you'll see these words are really commonly used, like mitigate climate change. That means reducing the amount of climate change that happens. And adapting to climate change means coping with climate change that is already happening. So coping with things like extreme events. You've probably seen lots of news recently about farmers coping with flooding, for example. That would be an example of an impact of climate change that's already happening that we have to cope with. And for it to be a nature-based solution to climate change, it has to do one of those two things, or possibly both. Some solutions do both. It also has to somehow help nature. So that could be by enhancing biodiversity, and biodiversity goes all the way from having good genetic diversity through to having strong, healthy populations of species, all the way up to ecosystems. So ecosystems would be the species and the area that they live in. And so ecosystem functioning would be things like providing shelter, that kind of thing, providing provisioning, so providing food, providing timber, and also with a bit of a link over to people, some of the less easy to quantify benefits from ecosystems would be things like benefits to people's health from being in nature. So a potential benefit to people could be a benefit to their health just from being in nature, and that could be mental health or physical health. But there's also economic benefits from the services that nature provides to us as well. So these are some examples of climate change mitigation. So this is reducing our emissions, so they're reducing the amount of climate change that happens. One thing that we could do with nature, with improving nature somehow, is to reduce the carbon emissions that are happening from our natural spaces. So if we have a forest and we cut it down, that emits carbon into the atmosphere. If we have peatland, so there's a lot of that in the north of this country, in Scotland, in Peak District, in Wales. If that's degraded, then there's a lot of carbon stored in the soil there, and if it erodes, then that goes out into that carbon store is lost. So one thing we could do is try and reduce those. Another thing we could do is if we have an ecosystem that is taking in carbon, like a woodland, then we could improve that by maybe reforesting areas that used to be forested, or restoring some of those peatlands so that they are what we call sequestering carbon, holding carbon um, on the hillside, essentially. And yeah, anything that we can do that helps take in carbon is going to help us reduce emissions. And that can be done in human communities as well. So actually in urban areas, I'll show you some examples later that actually tree planting in urban areas can be quite a good source, a good way to store carbon as well. Then the second thing we can do is help to cope with climate change, and that's called climate change adaptation. It's not the best choice of word. I didn't choose it. Adaptation often gets associated with evolution to scientists, but this is nothing to do with evolution. This is coping with climate change that is already happening. So the things that we might see impacts of already are things like coastal flooding. And so we can do things like salt marsh restoration in this country. Abroad in other countries, it might be something like mangrove planting, where you have a barrier for the coast against storm surges. So if you think that climate change is going to cause more storms in the future, then having some kind of barrier to the coastline is going to help cope with that. And then inland, if we have more extreme rainfall, you might expect to see more flooding, and indeed we are seeing that quite a lot at the moment in the UK, as you're probably aware. And you can use nature, or we could all use nature to help manage that flood risk inland as well, so in rivers. And we can do things like renaturalizing water courses. So a lot of the rivers and streams in the UK, but also across Europe and, well, pretty much everywhere really, have really been straightened. So the water runs down them really quickly, and that means they go downstream to urban areas really quickly, and that might be something we want to avoid. And wetlands are really, really good at holding water as well. That's why they're wetlands. So if we can create those, then we might hold water in place rather than have it flood downstream. That's coping with things like rainfall and extreme events and coastal flooding, but we can also think about things like cooling the urban environment. So in the picture at the top there, you can see some actually some nature-based solutions, some planting on rooftops, scattered in amongst them more technological ways of trying to reduce emissions. Solar panels there as well. But it's not like you have to do one or the other. For something to be considered a nature-based solution, it obviously has to benefit nature as well as cope with climate change. And actually, our experts said that some of the best ways to benefit nature by targeting nature-based solutions at it would be, first of all, to identify biodiversity hotspots. So we have 2% of UK land is under what's called species-rich grassland. So that's with lots and lots of different types of plants that you might not find in all places that are not all grasslands. So a lot of places that are grazed don't have this kind of thing. That protecting that is obviously going to be good for biodiversity. If you've got lots of species there and you protect it, then it's going to help keep nature in a good state. But also those grasslands tend to have really deep roots, so compared to normal grassland, which means that they help water get into the soil, so you stop flash flooding, and they also hold a lot more carbon in the soil. So you can see that it's going to benefit the nature, but also climate as well. We can do things like habitat restoration or creating new habitats. So a lot of the issues with nature, particularly in the UK, which is very nature impoverished, is that we have cut down or destroyed or grown over or built upon a lot of our natural habitat. And actually, so there is nowhere in the UK that would be really considered natural. The best that we have is what would be called semi-natural. But so to improve things for nature, we could do some habitat restoration. So we could restore some of the past. We could try and overcome some of the harm that we've done to nature in the past. Or we could create, so that's if we've got a habitat that's it's still there, but it's in a pretty bad state. Or we could even create new habitat in places as well. So things like the peatland restoration that I mentioned before, I'll talk about this, I think, a bit when I come to the peatland part. Things like having green roofs, you're looking at new places, you're putting new habitat into an urban area. or seagrass and kelp planting. Again, these are ecosystems that used to be there that we've lost, but if we put back there, can help both nature and help protect the coastline from climate change. And sometimes the one of the things that we could consider doing is actually just managing the places that we have already that are quite good for nature. So if we've got a woodland and it's a native woodland, so it's full of species that should be here, it's already going to be really good for nature, but perhaps we need to manage it to help it cope with, and the species that live there cope with climate change as well. And all of these things, all of these strategies are great strategies, but they wouldn't be considered a nature-based solution if they don't have some kind of benefit to people over and above the fact that climate change is being reduced or coped with. So some of the other benefits to people are things like health and well-being, as I said before. So it's really, really, really well established. I can't even say really enough, I don't think, link between health and well-being, so the time spent in nature. And that is particularly for mental health. I think there's a study that showed that if you spend at least 2 hours a week mental health than people that don't. And you might have heard of even green prescribing, which is where doctors would take a patient and say, I actually prescribe you to spend some time in nature every week for the benefit of your health. And that's really taking off in the UK at the moment. So perhaps by making better natural spaces, we can improve people's health and well-being as well. Often also things like tree planting might physically help things like air pollution, which is obviously going to help people's respiratory status as well. But there's some other things as well, like if we have this kind of taking off of nature-based solutions, then that might create new jobs in green industries. And this is really taking, particularly in Scotland at the moment, the really fast growth job sector, which is useful for the economy anyway, but also if people feel that they're doing something positive, they tend to be happier in their job as well and have better job satisfaction. And then finally, we might have things like cost saving. So obviously with flood prevention, if you're doing that kind of nature-based catchment management or putting things in place along the coastline, then you don't necessarily need to do what's known as hard engineering, hard infrastructure. So if you built a seawall to try and do the same thing, then that's going to cost you quite a lot of money. It's quite hard to do. It's quite logistically difficult. It's traditionally what's been done in the past. And also they can only really cope with a certain amount of climate change. So it could be a cheaper way of doing things than creating hard infrastructure. And also you have the cost savings of damages avoided to both built environments, the places that people live, and also agriculture. So if you have fields next to the coast and you're protecting those from coastal flooding, that means that there's no losses to crops there. So the farmer still has their income. So that's like some examples of the ways that nature-based solutions might help both with climate change, with helping nature and benefiting people. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a few examples from the report that we wrote. So you will see that the report that brought 100 plus experts together, we delineated that into habitats. So to an ecologist, this is the British Ecological Society report, this makes sense because we could put the experts into categories they were comfortable with. So I would say, I contributed mostly to the peatlands, heathlands and woodlands chapters because that's my expertise. And then when there were other experts contributing to the other chapters. But on reflection, I was just wondering what would be interesting to know your thoughts, whether we could have arranged it differently to communicate better to policymakers, because I don't know how much policymakers care about habitats. Maybe they don't care about them at all. It's probably just my biased view as an ecologist. So I'm going to take you through each of those habitat chapters just to give you a bit of an example from each one, and then I'll finish up. So woodlands, this is really the obvious one for climate change. It's the trees are the first thing that people think of. And woodlands are a relatively small amount of the UK land area, although they have been smaller in the past. We went down to 5% at one point, which means that some of the woodland is native, but a lot of it is conifer plantation that's been planted since the war, essentially. They do store quite a lot of carbon, and they sequester. So that means they take in almost 5% of the total UK emissions. So if we didn't have trees, we'd have to find some other way of getting closer to net zero, basically. They've also really high health benefits just of recreation. So there's estimates of six. That's about about oh, it's quite a lot per person. I think there's 60 something, 70 something million people in the UK. So that's already a big health benefit. I'm not very good at maths on the fly. They do things like removing air pollution and also reducing temperatures in urban areas as well. And you might have seen like microforests seem to be a thing that's taking off at the moment. And doing things like, if it's reducing the temperature, then you don't have to spend electricity on air conditioning, that kind of thing. So our experts came up with some kind of rules as to what you should do if you're doing a nature-based solution in woodland. First of all, if you're planting new trees, so putting trees where there aren't trees at the moment, generally that's a really good thing to do, but there's a few places where actually it wouldn't be a very good thing to do. So planting trees on peatlands where you've got a large amount of carbon stored in the soil is actually not a very useful thing to do for climate change because it dries out the soil and then you lose that carbon to erosion or to the atmosphere. Also, if you have productive agricultural lands, these are things that are providing us food. Then planting trees on those, if you planted them densely at least, is going to take up space that we need for food production. So it's maybe not, it might be good for nature, it might be good for climate, but it's not good for people overall. So it wouldn't be a nature-based solution. You could do things like, and likewise, if you've got special habitats that have high conservation value, planting trees on those is going to be bad for nature. Focusing on poor quality grazing land, so you're not taking up space that would have would be really productive to start with is a good thing to do. Reconnecting ancient woodlands is also a good thing to do, so species can move around, and that's something else that they're tending to be doing with climate change. And then, much as the forestry people like to think that coniferous woodland plantations are a nature-based solution to climate change, it's much better if you can use native species or not just have what's called a monoculture, just have one species of tree, because that's not very resilient, first of all, to pests and diseases, possibly to climate change. And it's also not as nice to look at, I would argue. If you're managing woodlands, then maybe doing things like reducing deer populations. This is something that's already done because those can stop regeneration of woodland. Potentially removing conifers from native woodland to make things better for nature. And doing what's called increasing canopy heterogeneity, that's basically making canopy gaps. So you've got some warmer areas and some colder areas in the woodland. Next on to heathlands. I've had to speed up a bit actually. Heathlands is, well, first of all, is a heathland. We have quite a lot next to us in Dorset. It's actually the one semi-natural habitat we have in the UK that we have a globally significant percentage of. So this is something that we actually are really important for on a global scale. But we've lost a lot of it over the last 150 years, and particularly in Dorset, through agricultural development and planting of conifers. So, as we said, planting conifers on peatlands is a bad thing to do, also on heathlands, not such a good thing to do. And our experts said that in heathlands, you need to just really make sure that because most of the carbon is in the soils, we're not disturbing that. If we're restoring degraded heath, a lot of it's become degraded to grassland, and it's not very productive grassland, so we could restore it to heath. That means that we've got a better below soil carbon store. We've got better above ground carbon store, and it's a bit more interesting for people to walk around as well. And if you're managing it, we could remove things that shouldn't be there, so conifers and large shrubs. That's particularly important if they dry the soil out because it's a fire risk. So we need to be careful with that, and so increasing fire breaks is a good thing to do. One of the ways of managing heathland to keep it as heathland, to stop it going onto forest, is burning, and we need to be sure that we're doing that really carefully under climate change because of the fire risks that we have. Peatlands, very, very similar to heathlands, except that they have a really deep soil peaty layer, and you probably are familiar with peat from garden centres. A lot of the peat in the UK is really degraded, so they do contain a lot of carbon. But overall, as a whole, they're a source of carbon dioxide. They're not a sink, and they should be a sink. They should store carbon dioxide as opposed to emitting it to the atmosphere. So what we need to be doing is trying to bring them back into good condition. And the problem with peatlands, a lot of the problem with their condition is that they were drained in the 70s and 80s to dry them out to make them better for grazing agriculture. So basically reversing that is the kind of management that we can do as a nature-based solution. You can see in the photos there's some examples of ways of doing that. And if you're an ecologist and interested in that, I'd talk you through those. If you want to know, you can ask later. But some of that restoration can be actually really, really fast. And I have to say, I was quite skeptical. This is a landscape that I did my PhD in. The picture on the left is what it looked like when I did my PhD and they started restoring it. So you can see that there have been some big bags of grass seed and heather, what's called brash, which is clippings from heather in other places, just dropped there. And they were dropped by helicopter. And it was about a £12 million project. It was quite expensive. And none of us were really sure if it was going to work. But actually, about 10 years later, you can see the picture on the right is from exactly the same place, but the landscape looks a lot different. So what they've done is basically try and revegetate by planting seeds and also bringing in seeds from those heather clippings. And I don't know about you, but if I'm going hiking in the Peak District, this is near Manchester, it's a big tourist destination, I would much rather walk through a landscape that looks like the one on the right than the one on the left. And so that's great as a kind of benefit to people. And then in terms of the climate, it's obviously going to be holding water on the hills. It's going to be stopping erosion down into the reservoirs, which is really useful. It's reducing downstream flood risk. And it's also much, much better for nature. That bare peat just doesn't have anything living on it, whereas the picture on the right has a lot more going for it in terms of nature. Grassland, we have a nice example near us. So wild woodbury, you may or may not have heard of, it's something that ecologists are certainly very aware of, is a grazing. It was a farm that was used for grazing 40 head of cattle, so not very many, plus growing the beans that fed those cattle through the winter. And it was bought by the Dorset Wildlife Trust. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment and let them tell you what happened 1 year on after they were doing that. Hopefully this works.
1 year into our community rewilding project, surveys have already recorded a remarkable increase in the biodiversity and bioabundance of wildlife on the 170-hectare site at Wild Woodbury. Our staff and volunteers have recorded over 1,300 species in this summer's surveys, including 680 species of invertebrates and over 250 species of plants. 8 birds on the red list of conservation concerns have been confirmed to be breeding at the site. The aim of the project is to build an exemplar for sustainable land use, to tackle the climate and ecological crises that we're facing, to open up more public access land for the surrounding community, and to restore natural processes across the site to make more space for nature.
So Wild Woodbury, they don't sell it as a nature-based solution to climate change, although they do mention the climate and ecological crisis at the end of the video there. It's very much done, it's been very much done by a wildlife trust to try and be beneficial to nature. So I thought I'd reflect on whether it is a nature-based solution to climate change. It's obviously had a benefit to nature, as seen with all those species that are now on the site that didn't used to be there. It used to just be very boring grazed land. So it definitely fulfills that criteria. Is there a benefit to climate? Well, one of the things that they said that they've done is basically they've pretended to be beavers. They've blocked up the drainage channels that were making the grassland dry. And you can see from the photo on the right that is now storing water on the land, which means that it's not going and flooding towns and villages, which is obviously one way of helping us cope with some of the extreme events that we might see from climate change. They also have increased carbon sequestration currently in the orchard that they've been planting, but over time, as the grassland becomes more natural, they'll see increased carbon sequestration in the soil there as well. And then importantly, does it benefit people? So you might have heard that they were talking about improving access. So this was a land that was managed by one of the very large estates nearby, and there wasn't very good access for people to it. So there's now a much bigger area of green space that has footpaths across it that people are allowed to go and visit now. So that's improved access. They've planted a community orchard, which means that people can go and take fruit and nuts and things from that in the future. And they also, although they've taken some land out of agricultural production, potentially by rewilding, there was only 40 head of cattle before, and it was all going to dog food. And now it is grazed by traditional breeds, which are still can be eaten by people. So actually, there's produce there that wasn't there before. So we're not losing anything by taking this land out of agricultural production. Okay, about halfway through on the habitats. Arable systems. So this is the fifth habitat that we thought could have nature-based solutions. So this is anywhere that grows crops, anything from fruit and vegetables to wheat. And again, you've probably seen that fruit and vegetables we're not very food secure on in this country, although we're better on wheat. And they actually hold quite a lot of carbon. So hedgerows are really good, and they've been lost over time. They're really good for storing carbon. Also, the field margins, which basically means the areas of more natural vegetation around the sides of the fields, those can be managed to store carbon and also help with erosion, so from storms and things like that. And also, they can help provide natural enemies to pests as well. And then we've got this thing called agroforestry. So this is just having trees and farming together, basically. So you can see the example on the right is from France, where they've got two different production systems together. You've got walnuts and wheat being grown together. And that's good because the trees provide shade for the crops in hot years. So that's useful for production of food, for coping with climate change. It's also obviously sequestering more carbon. There is a bit of a trade-off in that you lose some space to wheat for the trees. So you have to have the right equipment for this kind of thing. And this is being done kind of all over the place. You can see some other examples in the pictures there. And I think a really potentially good application of this is scattered trees in pasture land, so where livestock are, cows, sheep, that kind of thing, where they are. If you have some shade trees for them, then that's going to be good, a nature-based solution in an arable system without losing too much land to grazing. Freshwaters, these are really, really susceptible to climate change. So a few years ago, back in 2012, I think the project started, there was a project called the Keeping Rivers Cool project, which is a nature-based solution for freshwaters. And they had some demonstration catchments, that just means rivers that they were trying this out at, 4 of those, and they planted 55,000 trees and erected some fencing. So sometimes it's just about letting nature do its own thing and not having those riverbanks trampled, and then the vegetation comes back. And the idea is that it shades the river and cools it down. And then they produce these shade maps like the one on the right for the whole of the UK and made these publicly available. And they've said that since then, a lot of farmers have kind of looked at where they could plant trees, so the red areas where there's the least shade at the moment. And that has actually led to more people planting trees outside these demonstration catchments. So is it a nature-based solution? They claim it as one. It definitely cools the water temperature and takes up some carbon as well. It does help the things in the river. So it's actually done with trout and salmon in mind, because those are fish that like cold waters. And so if it can bring the temperature down to what they can cope with, then it's going to be good for the nature there. And also you get insects and things falling off the trees and into the river, so it's an extra food source. And is it good for people? This is a really difficult one to tell. Again, the tree roots help reduce erosion and therefore cope with flooding, and that could be good for people in terms of climate change. What isn't so well quantified, I guess, is whether there's any non-climate benefit to people, apart from maybe to anglers or people relying on the fish in the river. So this is the case where maybe the benefit to people hasn't been explored quite as much. Okay, moving on to coastlines. So one thing that we do a lot of, or there are lots of demonstration projects of, is managed realignment. So you might have heard this term, or you might not have. This is essentially if you've got an area where you currently have maybe hard engineering, so things like seawalls, that kind of thing, to try and stop the erosion of the coast. Maybe one thing that could be done instead is to actually allow that seawater into some areas of the coastline, and that means that the things like the salt marsh that help protect the coast, they kind of migrate inland as the sea level rises. So this is something that's being done strategically in a few places, and I'm going to give you an example of Medway and Sussex. And so you can see this is between Chichester and Selsey. So there's a main road that is quite close to the coast, which might be under threat if the hard engineering fails. So you can see some of the hard engineering down here on the coast. It's also some infrastructure. So there's the second largest mobile home park in Europe. There's a water treatment works that could become flooded. So all of those things are things that needs to be protected essentially from coastal flooding. So what they've decided to do is allow this area in kind of blue, where the blue arrows are, to flood, move the coastline inland a bit, but actually contain that with a new clay bank to contain the floodwaters. And what this should eventually turn to is currently arable land, but probably not very productive because it gets flooded anyway, and it's going to be full of salt. That's going to take all of the kind of seawater, give it somewhere to be, which hopefully protects the mobile home park and the water treatment works and the road, whilst also allowing eventually over time this should turn into maybe a salt marsh habitat, which is going to be good for nature as well. And so this is an aerial photo of what it looked like after they'd made a breach in the seawall to allow this water to come in. So this is another example, but you can see again this wouldn't work everywhere. You couldn't do this where there actually is coastal infrastructure without moving people, which could be quite a difficult thing to do. Okay, not forgetting the built environment. Most of us live in urban areas, and actually they have quite a lot of potential for nature-based solutions to climate change. So actually changing the nature of the chemistry of urban soils could actually improve the soil, but actually take up quite a lot of carbon dioxide. Whether that benefits people, again, that's a question that you'd have to go and someone would have to go and quantify that, but we're not sure. Leicester was cited as a really good example of having, it's quite a small area of the land, but because they've got so many urban trees, there's actually quite a lot, relatively compared to the area it takes up, of carbon stored there. So urban trees are a really nice way of taking up carbon, but also providing shading for people and providing just nicer environments for people to walk through as well. If you're doing that sort of thing, if you're planting trees in urban areas, anytime we plant trees, really, we have to make sure that those trees, if they're going to live for several hundred years, are going to be able to cope with the climate in the future. So there's a bit of expertise needed there on selecting species or varieties within species. That's the word. But yeah, in London, it's been worked out that the green space currently cools the city by 0.5 degree over what it would be if it wasn't there. Although they still have an urban heat island effect there, it would be worse if there wasn't green space. And so that's going to benefit people's well-being. It's quite easy to see that in the summer, if it's hot, then being under the shade of a tree is a nice place to be. Obviously, it has some impacts on reducing floods as well. And you can see that this is been taken up even by Bournemouth University. That's the bottom picture there. You can see that there's some green roofs there on campus. One of the things that doesn't get quantified quite so much from this is the benefit to nature. So actually, how much does it benefit nature having urban trees is still a bit of an outstanding question, I would say. So I'm going to basically wrap up now. I'm going to end with some caveats. I think nature-based solutions are really cool. I think it's great that they benefit people, they benefit nature, and they help us either cope with climate change or experience less climate change. But it's not a panacea. We still have to do something. We still have to reduce emissions in other places. We can't just plant forests to get ourselves to net zero. That's part of the solution, but not the full solution. And also any intervention that we do, even if it's trying to improve things for nature or doing something for climate, maybe with nature in mind, if it doesn't benefit all three of climate, biodiversity and people, then it shouldn't be considered a nature-based solution. And so I would argue that there's a lot of things that are put forward as nature-based solutions that maybe we don't yet know actually if they're beneficial for all three of those things. And one thing to consider is trade-offs and issues. So things like planting trees, it seems like an excellent idea. We shouldn't do it in certain habitats, as I said before. But also it could lead to things like safety concerns. We could lose grassland recreation space, so that would be a harm to people. You could have things like harvest being more difficult, which would be a harm to people again. If we do it in the wrong places, then we might lose biodiversity associated with other habitats. And if we do it in the wrong places, we could actually even release carbon from the soil. So there's always just planting trees isn't just the answer either. And when we have these kinds of trade-offs and issues, that's when involving people, talking to people, thinking about where we do what. So spatial planning is also really important. So our report actually had a chapter on spatial planning as well. So I'm going to leave with a question. These are 12 projects that are put forward by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, which is a UK linked to government organisation. The Keeping Rivers Cool project that I told you about is one of those. But I would say that a lot of these projects that they put forward as nature-based solutions, they haven't necessarily particularly considered whether they're beneficial to people. They've thought a lot about whether they do much for climate change. They've thought a lot about whether they do much for nature, but not so much about people. So there's still a lot to be explored there. So I'll end with that thought.